There's 4 basic ingredients in beer, and barley malt is one of them. Brett, where does Urban Artifact get their malt?
Well, Mike, that's a great question because I thought you were going to ask me what the other 3 ingredients in beer were, and I was prepared to say flesh, blood, and bone.
That one comes out in October.
But when I'm buying my malt, I buy from Malt Europe because they make the best quality malt at the best possible price. Some of the best breweries in the world use Malt Europe, and I am proud to say that Urban Artifact is one of those breweries.
Do you have to be a commercial brewery to use Malt Europe malt?
You don't. You can head down to your local homebrew store and you can find a wide selection of Malt Europe malts there. So if you're a pro brewer or a home brewer alike, get the best value, the best product at the best price. Get Malt Europe.
And they support us. So Prost.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast. My name is Brett Coleman Baker, owner and brewer at Urban Artifact in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I am here today with the one and only, the amazing bard of Cincinnati beer, Michael Morgan. Mike, how the hell are you?
I'm confused, Brett. Why do I have 2 nipples and only 1 liver? I mean, I don't really use the nipples for anything, but I use the hell out of the liver.
Well, if I cut your nipple off, it's not going to grow back.
Oh,
so
well, I mean, I
you can
don't
have that.
I enjoy them, I guess. I'm just saying I could use a second. I could get by with one of those if I could get a second liver.
I mean, we got 2 kidneys, for God's sakes.
Yeah, I don't even. Well, I think I use the hell out of those too. I probably need a second one of those. You need a kidney transplant. I'd like to help you out, but yeah, really, I'm probably gonna wreck the first one. So, yeah, no.
Well, this episode is brought to you by the hardest working organ in Mike's body, the liver. Thank you,
Yes.
liver.
And to all of you scientists out there working on how to grow me a new one in a pig, cheers.
On this episode in our series exploring how beer in America got to being only yellow and fizzy and next to water, we're going to look at Schlitz. Have you heard of Schlitz? You probably haven't. But there was a time when Schlitz was the number 2 beer in America. They were making great quality stuff. They had a huge amount of potential. They were the darling child of the stock market. This was the brand that was gonna be number 1. This was the brand that was gonna dominate American beer. But that wasn't the case. They fell from grace, and now you probably haven't even heard of them.
Brett, have you ever had a Schlitz?
I feel like you're making a dirty joke.
I didn't ask if you'd taken a Schlitz. Have you had a Schlitz? Have you drank a Schlitz?
Honestly, I thought a Schlitz was just a made-up sex position or something. No, I haven't. I feel like I have vague memories of seeing it on a store shelf in college and just thinking, who would drink a beer with a name like that?
I would.
I remember it being cheap.
It was cheap. I drank it for a while in college, and there were only 2 reasons why I did. 1, it was really cheap. And 2, they brought back this retro can. At the time, like all beer cans were silver. You know, it was like some unwritten rule in America that every beer can had to be silver. And Schlitz had this retro can that looked just like a Dr. Pepper can. So you could walk around the streets of Athens drinking beers, and cops would roll right by you, and it looked like you were drinking a soda.
Oh, look at this studious young man getting pepped up before his class, and really you're just getting tanked before going and blowing off class.
Right, absolutely. So Schlitz was good for that, but I don't remember anything else about it. You know, it's not like I drank it because it was better bad beer than the rest of the bad beer. It was just bad beer.
I mean, I can't even remember the last time seeing it at all in recent memory, let alone, like, is it still even made?
It is still made, and I don't know that from firsthand knowledge, but I looked it up on the internets recently, so what I'm telling you must be true. And what I've read is that it's still being made by the holding company that makes Pabst. It is not available across the United States. It's only in certain segments of the market. Walmart apparently carries it a lot, but I don't go to Walmart. So I don't know if it's available anywhere around here or not, but it is still out there somewhere in America.
Walmart is surprisingly like the biggest seller of beer in this country.
Yeah, I've heard that before. That's shocking or not, I guess.
Yeah, it's both. One, because I don't have any experience buying beer at Walmart, and two, like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
I'm sure it is not one of the large sellers of craft beer.
It's the best seller of Busch Light camo cans, though.
That I absolutely believe. It's kind of amazing for people that, read and talk and think as much about beer as we do, that neither one of us really knew this Schlitz story. I'd known that they had fallen from grace at some point, but that was the extent of it. And the details are really pretty crazy. I didn't understand how big they were, so let's start with that.
Mm-hmm.
Budweiser gets released in 1876. It wins a gold medal in Paris in 1878. And that's really when it becomes the king of beers. And it stayed that way until AB InBev started driving it off a cliff just recently, the past few years ago. But there was one time and one time only that Budweiser wasn't the number one selling beer in the country from the 1800s until the 2010s. And it was a period of time between 1954 and 1957 when Schlitz overtook it. And Schlitz was the number one best-selling beer in America.
Wow. I had no idea.
Yeah.
I figured just Budweiser dominated basically since it came about.
Budweiser was scared to death of Schlitz for a while. Not only were they number two, but they were neck and neck for at least a good 20 years. And when you got into the early 1970s, it actually looked like Schlitz was going to push Anheuser-Busch out. That Schlitz was going to reemerge as number one and could probably become the top beer company in the United States. They were really close to the Golden Ring.
The Golden Ring?
The Golden Ring, the one that Frodo and that thing likes. Or whatever. I don't even know what I just referenced. It's a whole thing.
The one beer to rule them all.
The one beer to rule them all.
And in the dark bar bind them.
There could be only one, and it was going to be Schlitz. There could be only one. So the way that plays out is that we talked in the last episode about how there's this big advertising wave from 64 to 74. Well, there's obviously multiple things happening in the world at once. And in the early 1970s, the thing that really tanked the Jimmy Carter presidency was really bad inflation. And we've been talking about inflation recently in the 2020s. But the last time we saw bad inflation, and it was a hell of a lot worse than it's been so far in the 2020s, knock on wood. But inflation was problematic for the brewing industry in particular. It got so bad that the prices of wholesale goods in the United States increased by 17%. That's about double what we've had to experience recently, and that has sucked a lot. But when you look at the brewing industry in particular, the cost of barley, hops, and rice all increased by 34%. So
it's untenable as a brewer.
Yeah, I mean, you guys, Urban Artifact has been struggling, I think, this past year or two with your base cost rising.
Yep.
And, you look at what that does to your bottom line, it can be dramatic. It can put you out of business. I mean, it can be the thing that kills you off.
A good manufacturing company has a profit margin, a net profit margin at the end of the day, anywhere between 2 to 7, 8%. If you're good. If you're great, 10%. So when you're talking 35% increase on your cost of goods sold, you're talking about no profit.
And it's part of what made Schlitz look like such a fantastic company. Their beer was popular, their advertising was good, and Schlitz became really innovative on how to increase their profit margins. So what Schlitz was doing had several prongs to it. For one, like Anheuser-Busch, they were expanding by building new plants, and they were looking at doubling their capacity as a brewery. which, as you mentioned in the last episode, we're not talking about going from 10,000 barrels a year to 20,000 barrels a year. We're talking about in the millions and millions. So they were doubling their capacity. They had very successful ad campaigns, but more importantly, they were looking for ways to directly cut the cost of making their beer. And the key to that was something that they called accelerated batch fermentation. What that meant was that they were using chemicals and a variety of mechanical processes to dramatically reduce the amount of time it took them to make a beer. And that let them drop the time it took them to make a Schlitz from 25 days to 15 days. Now, by comparison, Budweiser took 40 days to make. And from August Busch the first, that had been a big point of pride with Anheuser-Busch. It takes 40 days of beechwood aging to make a Budweiser, always, and that's what makes it such a good beer, makes it so delicious, and we're not going to change that. So Budweiser actually stuck to its guns and said, we're going to age our beer that much longer. And again, you as a brewer, when you're talking about that difference between 40 days versus 15 days, that's a significant difference in the capacity of what you can make as a brewery.
It means that for one tank of beer, I can make 3 times the amount at 15 days within that same tank at Budweiser. Because that same tank has to sit full for 40 days at Budweiser, where if I'm at Schlitz, I can turn that tank in 15 days. And so I can refill it, and then I can refill it again. So I'm making 2.5 to 3 times as much with a third of the infrastructure. This is huge.
So it's like dramatically expanding capacity without any additional capital expense of expanding capacity.
Which is, that's dream shit. Like, that's stuff that, shouldn't exist.
And that's why Schlitz looked fantastic as a company on paper. And that was in addition to them building a lot of additional capacity at the same time. The problem was that this accelerated batch fermentation was this combination of mechanical processes and chemicals. And they weren't just doing this. What Schlitz was also doing at the same time is something that most major American food companies have done over the past 20, 30 plus years, which is figure out how to incrementally make your product cheaper, do it in a way that you're kind of slipping things in. A company that I won't mention by name because I don't want to get sued, but was very famous for its macaroni and cheese. It did that over a period of time of phasing out every form of dairy in its macaroni and cheese and replacing it with chemical goop.
It's the frog in the boiling water parable.
Right. So Schlitz was doing that with its hops and its barley. It was substituting good hops for more hop syrups, which were cheaper. It was substituting good barley from some cheaper barley syrups. But it was doing that incrementally. It was cutting costs that way. And one of the keys to this accelerated batch fermentation was the chemicals that they were using to speed up the process of both clarifying their beer, which is one of the things that happens in the aging process. It kind of all solids settle and you get this very clear colored see-through beer, which is what people wanted in their American lagers. Now, the problem with that became that Anheuser-Busch, they're pretty prickly about what's going on with Schlitz because they want to stay number one. And they've also committed themselves to being a quality product. In this era, you've got both Gussie Busch, which was one of the heirs, and his son, August Busch III. They're both, and they kind of warred with each other, but, they were both at the top of the company in that period of time. Gussie Busch, his quote was, "As long as I'm in charge, I'm not going to lower quality." And August Busch III, although they argued about a lot of stuff, were in agreement with that. August Busch's quote was, "We're not going to trade cost efficiency for lower product quality." So to Anheuser-Busch's credit, they kept the same ingredients, they didn't cheapen their hops, they didn't cheapen their malt, and they didn't cut down their fermentation times. or their aging times. So to Wall Street, that made Anheuser-Busch look out of touch and just kind of dumb and old-fashioned as a company, particularly when all the costs of those ingredients go up by 34%.
They're self-inflicting, according to Wall Street, short-term pain. But
Yes.
Anheuser-Busch is doing it for long-term gain, which is never popular on Wall Street.
Right. Wall Street loves what you're going to make next quarter.
Yes.
And so Schlitz was a Wall Street darling. Anheuser-Busch stock started to drop significantly after inflation kicked in. And Schlitz stock, although it dropped a little bit with inflation, it overall started to go up. So Schlitz was a really smart buy on Wall Street, and Schlitz was becoming a more profitable company than Anheuser-Busch. Even though Anheuser-Busch was still selling a lot more beer at the time, Schlitz was more profitable as a company. So everything is going Schlitz's way. And the consumer doesn't really seem to notice that Schlitz has gotten progressively worse because they've done it incrementally, and to most consumers, it's not radically that different. Then things really go off the cliff. Schlitz hears that the federal government is about to start to require you to list all of the ingredients that you put in your beer on the can. And that was something that Anheuser-Busch was really pushing for because they were using good ingredients. And Schlitz gets afraid of that because some of these chemicals that they're using after, they're going into the final product. They're going into the can or the bottle.
Mm-hmm.
But the way the federal legislation was going to be written was that if they were using these chemicals in the process, but they weren't actually winding up in the final beer, you weren't going to have to list them.
Which is what we have today. They're called processing aids, and they don't need to be listed.
So that's still the law today.
Yes.
That's a nice little bit of trickery.
Which is really interesting because I can legally use gelatin in my beer to fine it and make it clear, which is derived from animal products, horse hooves and whatnot. But I don't have to, I can still claim it's vegan.
Nice.
Yeah. So
Nice.
legally, I can say my beer's vegan if I use gelatin. For the record, we don't use gelatin. Our beer is 100% vegan, both legally and morally. So there's no confusion there. But yes.
But thank you, FDA, for your honest approach to everything. So that law was just about to go into effect at that period of time. And Schlitz thought, shit, we don't want to put this nasty sounding chemical on our labeling because Anheuser-Busch is going to murder us over it.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be in every single ad. So they changed their chemical processes to do exactly what you just said, which was to clarify their beer and also to use a chemical to artificially increase the amount of head in the beer in the brewing process so that they wouldn't have to list either one of those ingredients on their labeling. Now, this also sounded great on paper, but because it was kind of a fast move that they did, nobody seems to have really tested or understood how those two particular chemicals were going to act together. And how they acted together was they formed these little white flakes that were in the beer. So when you got a Schlitz, and you poured it into a glass or you saw it in the bottle, it looked like it had dirt floating in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a good look for your beer. People didn't really dig that. But that was really just the start of the problem. Because those little white flakes, they didn't stay little white flakes. Once your beer sat for a little bit, the white flakes started to congeal together, and they looked like snot. They literally looked like huge snot goblets in your bottle of Schlitz. And that is not something consumers are big on. And I don't know if I can give you a tip today, Brett, just non-brewer to a brewer. Don't do that.
So stay
People
away
don't
from
like it.
slime-based textures in my beer. Is
Yes.
that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. People don't dig that. So Schlitz had to recall millions of cases of beer. They disputed it. The first recall was supposed to be 500,000 cases of beer. They publicly denied that. They said, it was a little problem with a few cases of beer. They recalled it. So the true number is in dispute.
If it was 500,000 cases of beer, by the way, in 1975, that might have been about $5 million worth of recall. That's $27 million today.
Good God.
So, and if that's the tip of the iceberg for the recalls,
Yes.
that is a significant financial hit.
It's a huge haircut.
Yes.
And their reaction to it was knee-jerk. Obviously you have to fix this immediately. And the problem, the chemist properly identified that it's these two chemicals working in conjunction with each other. So they just took one of the chemicals out, which resulted in a beer that had zero head, completely flat beer. So they replaced the snot beer with totally flat beer. And people didn't dig that either.
The head on a beer is really important. There's been scientific books written just about beer foam because it's so important. It adds a little bit to the aroma and taste, but most importantly, damn does it look good when you have a good, thick ring of foam on top of your beer.
Yeah, it looks good. It also, from the taste standpoint, most of the proteins in your beer are collecting in that foam, and they're hanging out there as that carbonation of the beer is expelling. And so it's where you're getting most of the aroma of a beer. With like a good craft beer today, particularly, if you dig really hoppy IPAs or something, you're really going to get all the aroma of that beer coming off of the head of it.
Mm-hmm.
As an aside, Brett, I have to stand up in front of college classes and talk about good head and dry hopping. And I have to do it without any inappropriate references. And every time I do, you see multiple students in class who think that, they're geniuses for having figured out the innuendo that's involved in those various phrases. But it's difficult.
Well, it's not too different than the bunghole on a barrel, for instance.
Right.
No, sometimes you have to stick the sampling rod into the bunghole to pull a sample of beer. And, it's really hard not to laugh. Because I'll be damned if it isn't hilarious.
And we're kind of 12. But, so the head on your beer is, in fact, really important to it, even just from appearance. And beyond that, flavor. We're talking about it not just having a good head retention. We're talking about there being no carbonation in it. It's just flat as hell.
Yeah.
It tastes like a beer that's been sitting out for 5 or 6 days. So they recall that. And total number of beers, I don't know if anybody really knows the truth, but they had this whole war crime thing going on there around Schlitz. They're recalling millions of beers and digging holes and doing mass graves of Schlitz beer. So, it is a complete, absolute, economists call it technically total clusterfuck. They destroyed this brand.
TCF, I've heard that.
Yeah. So it falls completely off a cliff. Almost overnight, Schlitz goes from being the number 2 beer in the country and the most profitable brewery to being something absolutely nobody wants to buy. Its stock plummets, its market share plummets, consumers are disgusted and write it off permanently, and the damage was so bad, there was absolutely nothing that they could ever do to recover.
And this is why quality is important, and this is why reputation matters. Because when you lose the trust of the consumer, you fucked.
Yeah. If you do it bad enough, you're gone forever. And they wound up getting sold to Stroh's in 1982. At the time, Stroh's was just a regional. So the number 2 largest brewery in the United States was bought by a relatively small regional brewery. That did for a while make Stroh's Schlitz number 3 in the country. They didn't hang on to that spot that long, and Stroh's eventually went under 2. But
Man, it was such a poison brand that it poisoned Stroh's and took them down.
yeah, did that too. They still had their malt liquor, their bull, that held on. But Stroh's did, what happens often when you have to buy a harmed brand, they turned it into a budget brand. So they never again even tried to say, drink Schlitz, it's great beer, it's as good as Budweiser. That's when they made the move to drink Schlitz because it's cheap, man. Schlitz, it's beer, it'll get you drunk, and it costs like half of what a Budweiser does. So it was done. It was dead forever. And that's the story of Schlitz. But as you say, I think that there's also there's modern questions around it that I'd like to hash out with you as somebody that faces the reality of these things. Because what you just said is what I think is the optimal golden rule kind of moral of this story. And that is, don't screw your consumer. Quality matters, make a good product. But at the same time, when you're facing major cost increases and major increases in your, base ingredient expenses, and your profit margin isn't that large, you have to make practical decisions.
You have to make hard decisions.
You have to make hard decisions. And I think that there's a more complex lesson with Schlitz because once they had snot in their beer, they were over. But that didn't happen. I mean, the snot in the beer thing kind of happened overnight, but they didn't get there overnight. They cost cut and cost cut and cost cut and cost cut. They were doing it gradually, step by step by step by step. They kept making a shittier and shittier and shittier beer, and the consumer kept drinking it in the same amount. They didn't catch on. Like the aforementioned macaroni and cheese, they didn't notice.
And, at the time, I bet it was a really easy decision for them to make because they came so far down the slippery slope of cutting quality and cutting costs on your ingredient side that they were at the point where with the proposed legislation that was going to come into effect, to them, they only had one decision to make, and it was to make that final jump into just the bottom of the barrel trash quality realm. When really the harder decision that should have been made of, crap, we need to relook at what we're doing and re-elevate our product before it's too late. Would that have hurt their stock price in the short term? Yes. Would that have hurt the profitability in the short term? Yes. But could Schlitz still be here as one of the top 3 beers instead of Coors? Yeah, probably.
Could be outselling Budweiser.
It very well could.
And Budweiser, for all of the evil that they did, even before they became AB InBev, those guys stuck to quality. They stuck to their guns, and they took a hit for it. They took a hit for it for a while. But why are they still around? Why is the Budweiser name still in the top selling beer in the United States? It's Bud Light, not Budweiser anymore. But, actually, it's not even that now, is it?
No.
Modelo. It's like Modelo, Coors
Modelo
Light.
and Mich Ultra are both the top 2.
Yeah, okay.
So
still an AB product, but yes. Yeah. And I'm not going to defend Mich Ultra. But the point being, until very recent times, just regular Budweiser still remained a beer with an unparalleled reputation.
Until they sold out to a Brazilian private equity firm and started cutting costs anywhere they could.
Yeah. AB InBev started doing to Budweiser what Schlitz did to Schlitz back then. And it started to hurt them. But, how much of that is the consumer is noticing it? I don't know.
And that's what craft beer was built on, was quality is paramount. Above all else, quality. And those initial breweries had the success they did because of quality. Fritz, over at Anchor Brewing Company, who we talked to in episode 3, he hates sour beer because to him it was a sign of bad quality. Right. It meant uncontrolled microbial activity in their beer.
Still is when you're not meaning to do it.
Exactly. So quality became paramount, and that's honestly I think while we're at a current reckoning in craft beer, it's because we're running up against two things in craft beer as a whole: inflation causing prices to continue to go up on already a super premium product,
Right.
and breweries at this point so desperate to stay relevant that they're throwing gummy worms and other horse shit into their products that aren't quality. So
Right.
they're literally adding the metaphorical snot to their products on purpose and
Yeah.
selling it to people, and then wondering why people are getting outraged when they're buying blue-colored beers that taste like gummy worms and feel like you're slurping snot. Like we're at a similar reckoning point.
They're looking for those fads, but yeah, a niche and a fad and a gimmick, they're different things.
Yes, a niche has staying power, fads and gimmicks, flashes in the pan.
Yeah, so that is the sad-ish story of Schlitz. I mean, I guess sad in a way, but sad not in a way, because when you really screw your consumer, it's the story of what can and really should happen to you at the end of the day.
Beer can be art, and it can be elevated. It can also be a consumer good, and it can be cheap and tasty. But if it's neither of those things and it's just bad, well, you're going to pay.
You're going to pay. I will say, and maybe we leave that there because I think it's a good ending, but Brett, one of the things that I've noticed recently, just in my own drinking, there is a specific beer that I'm not going to name, but it's one of the Cincinnati beers that has had some of the best distribution. It's one of the largest growing Cincinnati craft brands. And that beer is a very kind of traditional meaning of the new wave West Coast IPAs. Very dank IPA. And I started drinking that beer. I mean, I've drank it off and on for years. I know what it tastes like. And I started drinking it occasionally because it has good enough distribution that it's often the best beer you can find, in bars that don't have great beer selections.
It's like finding Sam Adams at B-Dubs in the 2010s.
Exactly. Yeah. It's
You're thankful it's there.
Yes, right. They dramatically changed the hops they were using in that beer. And I actually think it produces maybe a better beer, but it's definitely a different beer. And for a beer that is known predominantly for the flavors that are derived from the hops, to significantly alter that is, to me, and I don't even know that that's a cost thing. It made it a less dank West Coast beer, made it more akin to something kind of like a Bell's with a little bit of fruitiness to it in a time where New England's are the whole big rage. But the moral being, they made a shift that, to me, when I tasted those beers, I thought, damn, that is a dramatic change in this beer. But I don't know that anybody has noticed. I'm not the only one. I mean, I'm not like some guy with a super palate out there. There are other people, I'm sure, that observed the same thing.
Oh, people have noticed, I'm sure.
But it's not like it's something you hear. I haven't heard anybody talking about it. It's not like there's big buzz. The internet or some Reddit feed is exploding with how this beer changed. So the real question is, I mean, how much can you dick around with a product with 80% of the consumer not noticing?
Well, that's that whole slippery slope of the macaroni and cheese manufacturer. Or Schlitz, as you get into this habit of like, oh, I made a small change and only 0.1% of my customer base noticed. I guess I'll keep this change that's slightly cheaper. Oh, I can make another small change and most people aren't going to notice yet again. And before you know it, you have this product that is a far cry from where it was, but the amount of people that noticed is really low until you finally hit that straw that broke the camel's back. Now, in this particular instance that you're mentioning, it could be a couple things. It could just be a different crop year of hops, which leads to slightly different flavors. Simcoe is notorious for tasting like cat piss if it's harvested at the wrong time or growing conditions are significantly off. I don't think it's that. It could be that the availability of that hop isn't around or harder to get because of, for whatever reason. I don't think it's that because they have the buying
Could be
power.
temporary and not
Could be
intentional.
temporary. It could be that they wanted to change the flavor profile because American flavor profiles are changing and the West Coast dank IPAs just aren't selling like they were, and juicy everything's selling. So they might have just made a slight shift on purpose.
Which is what I suspect, and I don't think it was necessarily a bad move.
And it could also tie into with slightly different, cheaper hops as well. Probably doesn't, but it could. So it could be any of those things. Or it could just be because they want to do it cheaper and they know that people aren't going to notice that much of a difference. Back when we were brewing Finn, occasionally, because we didn't always have a contract for our hops because we didn't use enough, I couldn't get certain hops. And I would substitute in ones that had similar flavor profiles. And we'd make similar batch sizes that we always do with these different hops. And I always had only one customer ever reach out. And she was freaking pissed anytime the recipe changed in the slightest. She'd be like, what is wrong with this batch? It tastes different. Only person in our entire distribution network to ever say anything, but she picked it out every time. So I guess obviously I don't have an answer, but I think you're probably right in that it's a shifting of palates thing. And much like, I don't know if you noticed, but Fat Tire is no longer an amber ale. It is now.
Wow, really?
Yep, it's now far closer to a light lager. They still claim it's an ale than it is an amber ale, and they're not calling it an amber anymore. It's just Fat Tire. And
that's a ballsy thing to do to what's been one of the top-selling craft beers in the country.
Well, sales have been flagging, so they're changing the recipe, but they're not changing the branding or anything else about it.
Wow.
So it could be. My gut is that you're right, is that they're just going for a more popular flavor profile without doing an announcement, without changing the branding, and just hoping that sales continue to tick up because of it.
And most people aren't going to notice.
And most people won't.
And actually, even that reminded me, I was talking to a guy that used to work for Hootapole Shanlane, and he was one of the people behind Little Kings that we discussed earlier. And he was telling me a depressing story when they changed one of the major ingredients in Little Kings. I don't remember what it was. I think that was a cost-cutting thing, that maybe they went from, malt, all malt, to like some malt syrup or whatever. But don't quote me on that one. The point was that it was a modification of the recipe and it was a cheapening, and he was really proud of Little Kings and the recipe and the quality of it at that period of time. We're talking about the 70s, 80s. And so he thought that when they changed the recipe, he was going to be flooded with consumer complaints. And he got none.
Mm-hmm.
And then they changed something on the label.
Oh, God damn it.
And he was flooded. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people bitching and complaining like it was the end of the world because they modified something on the label. They could wreck the beer and the consumer didn't even notice, but they changed some small stupid thing on the label and people went ape shit.
The same thing happened when I was working at Cargill as a project engineer. One of my first big projects was we were changing bag types. We were going from a pull top bag where you pull a string and the bag opens up and you could scoop your flour out to one where you had to rip it because you blow the flour in, yada, yada, yada. Long story short, nothing changed with the label art, with the labels. The only thing that changed was the bag itself, how you opened it. The amount of complaints that we got from New York City pizza makers was out of control. It was crazy. All these complaints about the recipe has changed, the flour is different, my pizza's not behaving the right way, all of this stuff. And the whole time I'm just losing my mind thinking nothing's changed. It was just the bag.
It was the exact same flour.
It was the exact same flour. The exact same. Literally nothing different. Just people losing their minds. And I think that's what's important here is for you, out there when you see these changes with branding and marketing, you have visceral reactions to it and it can make you think things that aren't true because you have such strong ties emotionally to this beverage that you might be consuming 4, 5, 10 times a night, a week, or whatever. So you have this emotional connection to it, and when someone changes it, it can almost feel like a personal attack. But I think it's important to step away as a consumer in America and look at, like, this change isn't a change to the liquid on the inside. It's a change that's designed literally to elicit emotional reaction in you, the consumer, ideally in order to get more and newer people to buy the product, but also potentially to mess with you on purpose one way or the other. So I think it's important to realize that branding isn't the same thing as the product itself.
And I think typically, people will sometimes change the product, as Sam Adams recently did to some extent on their Boston Lager,
Yep.
and as Fat Tire did dramatically, turning Fat Tire amber into a blonde. But when people do that, when companies do that, you typically don't change your packaging. You keep your packaging intentionally the same so that fewer people notice that the product is different. When you change the packaging, you're not going to change the product at the same time.
No, and it's all this whole cat and mouse game, and it's something that these large corporations are so good at too, is you only change one thing at a time, and it's a small change.
Right.
And especially if you're cutting costs and you're cutting corners, I'm going to start using a little bit lower quality grain. I'm going to start using a little bit worse quality hops. And then all of a sudden, you look back 30 years later and you're like, why does this taste different than when I remembered 30 years ago? Did my taste change or did something change with it? And usually it's a combination of the both, and most people don't have good taste memories anyway. So before you know it, you're getting screwed.
Yeah, sometimes it's nostalgia, but also sometimes you're just truly getting screwed.
Yeah, sometimes it's literally just a worse product.
And we're all highly suggestible, some of us more so than others.
I believe everything I hear.
I only believe it if it's on the internet because it's a very trustable source.
Well, if it's written down, you know it's true.
Yes, absolutely. If it's in writing, physical writing somewhere, it has to be true.
So anyway, that was the story of Schlitz.
A fantastic story about greed, overreach, and collapse. It's really kind of poetic. It's Shakespearian in its nature.
What I love about capitalism is obviously the success stories, but a part of capitalism that I feel like we often overlook in this too big to fail, all this nonsense, is also the collapse of big companies, because it's just a part of healthy capitalism. You rise and you fall, you rise and you fall, and this was an epic fall.
Greed eventually collapses in on itself. And what we're not going to do when we leave here today is drink a Schlitz.
And not because we don't necessarily want to, it's because we can't even find it.
And if we could find it, I'm sure it sucks. But I would like to try one.
With a name like that, with a name like Schlitz.
Good. With a name like Schlitz, it has to taste like Schlitz. Cheers, Brett.
Cheers. Let's go Schlitz ourselves. I know we joke a lot and we're serious when we need to be about our beer knowledge, education, stories, craft, and history of everything we talked about. But we've never really taken a moment to thank you for listening and thank you for trusting us to deliver the highest quality content and information that we can. So thank you.
Yeah, we didn't thank you initially because there was only 5 of you. But we've grown, we've grown the audience some, and that is due in large part to word of mouth. And we really do care about this subject matter. We think that it's not the most important thing in the world, but it's important. It's important to an understanding of our country and consumer trends and really who we are and the basic choices we make on a daily basis. So it's something that we care about, and thank you for caring, and thank you for listening to us and supporting us, and for giving us those 5-star ratings and the likes and the shares and subscribing and all of those things. So thanks, and please keep doing it.
Yeah, if you love us as much as we love you, please leave a review. Reach out. Just start a dialogue with us. We'll be in touch. We want to hear from you. We love hearing from you, and we're happy to respond and answer any more questions. Or if you have an idea for an episode, reach on out, and we'll explore it more in depth as soon as we can.
BruceGuys.beer, you can get a hold of us.
The Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast is a production of Brew Skies Limited in association with 779, a leading video production and content creation agency. With over a decade of experience, 779 works with a wide range of clients, from global brands to boutique startups to mom and pop shops. Visit 779video.com for more information. That's the numbers 779video.com. This episode was edited by Dan Fennessy, who is also our executive producer. This podcast was engineered by Adam Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.